Thank you for tuning into the Candyland Murders channel. On this episode, we will dive into crimes that took place on a haunted Halloween day or night. Boo! So was this a trick or a treat? These are true stories of 13 brutal and deadly murders that took place on Halloween in a town near you. So, sit back, relax, and grab a hold of your seat. It's gonna be a bumpy ride. Forget about all the scary Hollywood plays, urban legends, and ghost stories. These events all occurred on Halloween, and they are all real. Number 1. Following the disappearance of a Halloween candy bag, a man stabs and kills his lover. Liddell Peoples, 55, of Chicago's South Side, accused his girlfriend of taking his bag of Halloween candy in 2011. Maria Adams, 49, hurled a plate at Peoples's head during the ensuing argument, striking him above the eye and leaving a gash. After that, Peoples took out a knife and fatally stabbed the victim. Number 2. A father feeds his son poisonous Halloween treats. People who deliberately poisoned strangers. In this 1974 case in Deer Park, Texas, a father laced his son's pixie sticks with cyanide with the intention of killing him so he could collect on an insurance policy. Halloween candy is typically the stuff of urban legend. The father, Ronald Clark O'Brien, made the decision to murder his son to escape the deep financial hole he had created for himself. He bought 5 pixie stick straws, sprinkled them with potassium cyanide, hastily stapled them shut, and gave them to his daughter, son, and 3 other neighborhood youngsters. His plan was to murder them all and place the blame on a neighbor to avoid suspicion. O'Brien's 11-year-old son, Timothy, ingested the pixie sticks powder and reportedly did so at his father's request. He afterwards complained that the substance felt bitter. He soon started vomiting violently and died before getting to the hospital. O'Brien was executed by lethal injection after being found guilty of murder. The nicknames the Candyman and the Man Who Killed Halloween were later bestowed upon him. Number 3. When a man confronts the kids who egged his car, he is shot. On Halloween in 1998, 21-year-old computer programmer Carl Jackson was traveling through the notoriously dangerous South Bronx with his girlfriend and her son when he was attacked by a group of neighborhood baddies. After engaging them in conversation, Jackson exited the vehicle and returned to it. One of the kids hopped in a car and drove after Jackson. A few blocks later, they caught up with him and shot him once in the head to kill him. Number 4. While trick-or-treating, a 7-year-old kid was shot and killed. Tony Bagley, 7, was trick-or-treating on Halloween night in 1994 on the north side of Las Vegas with his sister, mother, and aunt while dressed as a skeleton. A man in a hooded sweatsuit suddenly appeared and opened fire on the family before getting into a getaway vehicle that drove off with its lights off. Tony's mother was shot in the chest, his aunt was shot in the leg, and his sister was shot in the liver, but they all made it out alive. Unfortunately, Tony didn't. A few years later, his biological father was taken into custody for an unrelated street shooting despite reportedly never commenting to the authorities about Tony's death. Tony's murder has not yet been solved. Number 5. On Halloween, a man opens the door and is fatally shot. When Betty Fabiano, a resident of Los Angeles, and Peter Fabiano were having marital difficulties in 1957, Betty momentarily left their home and moved in with Joan Rabel. Rabble was overcome with resentment when Betty moved back home with Peter after their reconciliation. She and Goldine Pizer planned to kill Fabiano on Halloween because they believed it was the best night of the year to dress in disguise without drawing attention to themselves. Rabble made Pizer a costume that included red gloves, makeup, and a mask. On Halloween night, the pair waited for the Fabiano home's bedroom lights to be turned out for 2 hours outside. Pizer stepped up to the house and rang the doorbell as soon as the lights went out. In response, Fabiano spoke, possibly anticipating a trick-or-treater at midnight. Pizer used a .38 caliber handgun to kill him by shooting him in the chest. Number 6. When trick-or-treaters knock on a man's door, he opens fire with an AK-47. Quentin Patrick, a convicted drug dealer from Sumter, South Carolina, heard a knock at his home on Halloween night in 2008. He grabbed his fully automatic AK-47, thinking they were members of another gang, and fired at least 29 rounds through his front door at them. T.J. Durisaw, a 12-year-old trick-or-treater, was killed when he was struck by 11 of those bullets. T.J.'s father and younger brother were also struck but lived. Number 7. After killing a woman by strangling her, a preacher dresses up her son for Halloween. John D. White was paroled despite having previously served separate jail terms for killing one woman and slashing another. He then became the pastor of a tiny church in Michigan. He lived in a trailer park, fell in love with a woman who lived a few trailers down, and frequently watched her 3-year-old grandson. White killed the boy's mother on Halloween night 2012 while the young boy was inside the trailer. He used a rubber mallet to knock her out and then a plastic zip tie to strangle her. He placed her in a trash bag before discarding her in the forest. The boy's father then arrived to pick him up after the man went back to the trailer and dressed him in a costume for Halloween. In response to being accused of murder, White claimed to have forgotten whether or not he had carried out a long-standing ambition to have sex with a corpse. Number 8. An elderly nun was allegedly raped by a teenager and then fatally stabbed. According to all of the evidence, Johnny Lee Garrett had a traumatic childhood filled with physical and sexual abuse that caused him to become schizophrenic and brain-damaged. In 28 years of practice, a psychologist who examined Garrett claimed that his life narrative was one of the most virulent histories of abuse and neglect that he had ever seen. In the early hours of Halloween in 1981, when Garrett was 17 years old, a 76-year-old nun in Amarillo, Texas, was raped and fatally stabbed. On her headboard, Garrett's fingerprints were discovered. Police claim he confessed to the killing in a statement he wouldn't sign. And this is what Garrett said to the police. In the bed, a nun was acting as though she was going to scream. She couldn't speak because I put my hand over her lips. I started choking her until she collapsed. She and I had sex. The very same path that led me into the convent is the same path that led me away from the convent. Later, Garrett claimed that he had burglarized the convent just before Halloween rather than having murdered her. He was nonetheless found guilty of murder and given the death penalty. Even though it appeared to be a straightforward case, new information raised questions about Garrett's guilt. These specifics include a prosecutor who eventually committed suicide, a forensic investigator who was found guilty of fabricating evidence in numerous trials, and a killer who confessed to the crime to police. Even the Pope asked the Texas governor not to put Garrett to death for killing the nun because the doubt was so strong. But Garrett was put to death in 1992 after receiving a brief reprieve. Number 9. A female hitchhiker is tortured to death by the Toolbox Killers as they film it on tape. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, who abducted, raped, tortured, and killed 5 adolescent California girls in 1979, became known as the Toolbox Killers because they frequently used tools like pliers and hammers. Shirley Ledford, 16, was murdered in the final of these killings after she was seen hitchhiking home from a Halloween party. After picking her up in their vehicle, they bound and gagged her, repeatedly hit her elbow with a hammer, sodomized her with pliers, and then strangled her to death with a wire coat hanger before throwing her body on an undetermined front lawn. They videotaped themselves mocking Ledford as she cried out for mercy while carrying out her murder. Later, Norris was quoted as saying, "In horror movies, we've all heard women scream. Even so, we are aware that nobody is actually yelling. Why? This is only because an actress is unable to make certain noises that might otherwise serve to convey something disgusting and awful. There is simply no way that you could listen to that tape without crying and trembling. You probably couldn't listen to it for more than a full 60 seconds. Number 10. A woman dressed as Betty Boop is fatally stabbed by a man. After being raised in Oklahoma, Jeremy Bryan Jones, a nomad and self-described ladies' guy, ended up in Georgia. He soon made a friend who welcomed him into her home. After dressing up the mother's 12-year-old son and the boy's friend to resemble Ace Frehley and Gene Simmons of the rock band Kiss on Halloween 2012, Jones traveled to a well-known bar in Douglasville, Georgia, where he fatally stabbed a woman dressed as Betty Boop in the parking lot. Number 11. A teenager from Brooklyn is killed by a man wearing a scream mask. On the streets of Brooklyn in New York, on Halloween of last year, a man impersonating the Scream Killer in a ghost face mask shot and killed Anthony Seabury, a 19-year-old. The matter has not been resolved. Number 12. A 9-year-old girl is raped, tortured, and murdered by a man. Lisa French, then 9 years old and from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, dressed up as a hobo on Halloween night in 1973 and went trick-or-treating. Gerald Turner answered the door when she rang his doorbell and let her inside after closing the door behind her. Later, Turner would say, "Even now, I can vividly picture you grinning broadly in the doorway, wearing that felt hat and remembering me. As I closed the door behind you, I noticed that the joy in your eyes has changed to fear." He killed her after sexually assaulting her, wrapped her body in plastic, and abandoned it in a field. Even though he was found guilty of her murder, he was eventually released on parole, and after Waste Management of Madison turned him down for a job, he filed a discrimination claim. Number 13. A teenage girl is murdered by a serial killer and then dismembered into 3 pieces. Richard Biegenwald had a very difficult childhood with beatings and suffering, like many boys who grow up to be killers. He also exhibited psychotic traits of his own quite early on. He set the family home on fire when he was 5. At the age of 8, he began drinking. He began electroshock therapy when he was 9. He attempted to light himself on fire when he was 11. On Halloween night in 1981, he committed one of his alleged 5 killings. Maria Chialella, a 17-year-old from Brick, New Jersey, had been trick-or-treating late at night. She was seen by a patrolman on Route 88 shortly after midnight as she was heading home alone. He drove around again about 10 minutes later to offer her a ride, but she had already left. Her body was eventually discovered in the Staten Island yard of Biegenwald's mother's home, hacked into 3 parts and buried. There are many stories like this that could have turned out different. Here are some tips to help you stay safe during this Halloween season. Be aware of your surroundings. Don't take drinks from strangers at bars and stick with your friends and family if you're out at night. As we have completed this episode, please stay tuned for more stories like this, and also like, share and subscribe to this channel for more. Happy Halloween to all!